couple of years ago, my friend Kate asked me to go with her to a party. The party was being thrown by a girl named Susan. Kate had gone to Catholic school with her from elementary through middle school, but once high school started, they drifted apart. Kate ended up going to a public school, which is where I met her, and Susan had stayed on the Catholic school track. They still talked once in a while, but they weren't close like they used to be. I guess that's why Kate brought me along. Probably so she wouldn't feel so out of place around Susan's new circle of friends. It was Susan's birthday, and her parents had apparently rented out a cabin for the weekend to celebrate. From what Kate told me, they had done the same thing the year before, and Susan had taken advantage of it by throwing a party behind their backs. That party had been a hit, so this year she decided to do it again. Kate seemed excited about it, but I was a little more hesitant. I didn't know anyone except Kate, and I didn't have the kind of outgoing personality that made it easy to jump into a new group of people. I figured I'd hang close to Kate, have a few drinks, and make the best of it. I also couldn't ignore the horror movie vibes. Teenagers partying in a cabin in the woods, far from town, in the dead of winter, practically screamed disaster. Kate and I even joked about it on the drive there. We arrived a little after 8 p.m., and it was already pitch black outside. The road getting there was narrow and surrounded by trees, the kind that looked like they'd swallow you whole if you wandered off the shoulder. When we pulled up to the cabin, there were a few cars already parked out front, but not many. We had to use our phone flashlights just to find the walkway up to the front door. The snow on the ground hadn't been shoveled, so we had to trudge through several inches of it, and the cold wind didn't help. Inside, the place looked normal enough. It was warm, the lights were low, music was playing, and there were already at least 20 people mingling around. Susan greeted Kate like they were still best friends, and I got introduced briefly, but then everyone went back to doing their own thing. The cabin had that old wood-paneled interior, a big stone fireplace, though it wasn't lit, and thick curtains drawn over all the windows. A long table in the corner was crowded with bottles and solo cups, and the smell of cheap alcohol hung heavy in the air. For the first hour or so, everything was pretty uneventful. Kate and I stuck together, occasionally making awkward small talk with strangers. We found a couch to sit on for a bit, and I people-watched while sipping a warm beer someone handed me. What I started noticing, though, was this weird divide in the party. There seemed to be two groups. The ones who were clearly Susan's Catholic school friends, dressed kind of preppy, acting overly polite, laughing a little too loud, and then this other group. They were louder, rougher around the edges, and clearly more into drinking than mingling. There was one guy who caught my attention. He had the name of the city we lived in tattooed across his neck in big, messy letters. Kate and I exchanged glances when we saw it. We weren't laughing exactly, but it gave off this vibe that maybe he was trying a little too hard to seem tough. Still, we couldn't help but wonder if he might actually be dangerous. The whole group he came with had that energy, like they weren't there to celebrate a birthday, but just to get drunk and stir things up. At some point, I guess tensions started rising. I didn't catch the beginning of it, but from what I gathered later, that rougher group had shown up without bringing anything. No drinks, no food, and we're just going through everyone else's stuff. People started whispering that one of them might be on probation, and someone else said Susan hadn't even invited all of them, just the one girl who brought the rest along. The plan to get them to leave was weirdly simple. One of the Catholic school guys announced that a ranger or caretaker or someone like that was going to be driving by the cabin soon, checking for cars and noise complaints. He made it sound official, like if there were too many people or cars, someone could get into serious trouble. It worked surprisingly. The group grumbled a bit, but they left. There were about 5 guys and 1 girl. I remember feeling relieved. The tension in the room dropped, and people started laughing again. Kate and I stood by the kitchen chatting with a couple of people, when suddenly that same girl who had just left with the group walked back in. She stood near the doorway and loudly said she just wanted to say happy birthday. It didn't sound sincere. It sounded like she wanted everyone to hear her. Before anyone could even process what was happening, we heard a loud crashing sound from the back of the cabin. It was a window, then another, then yelling. Someone shouted something about people trying to get back in. Glass was breaking, people were screaming, and everything dissolved into chaos. I just stood there, frozen. Kate grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the front of the cabin, away from the noise. I couldn't even think. All I remember was someone yelling that at least one of the guys had a gun. That's when it felt real. All the joking about horror movies disappeared in an instant. Most of us stayed inside the main room, too afraid to go anywhere else. A couple of guys went outside to see what was happening, but they came back quickly and said the group had taken off. Apparently, they didn't actually come inside, just broke the windows and screamed threats before running off into the woods. Still, nobody wanted to take any chances. People started packing up and leaving soon after that. I remember 3 girls who had originally planned to stay the night. They had their sleeping bags and backpacks piled in their arms and were heading out the front door when a scream echoed through the trees. All 3 of them jumped and practically sprinted back inside. Turned out the scream was just a new girl arriving. She'd seen her friend outside and screamed in excitement. That kind of summed up the whole night. Too much tension, not enough sense. One of the girls started crying after that. It was just too much. Kate and I stayed behind for a while longer. Susan was clearly shaken, and we didn't want to leave her alone. Most of the people were gone by then, just a handful stuck around, planning to spend the night in sleeping bags and on couches. Around 2 a.m., we finally left. We debated calling the cops, but nobody wanted to get in trouble. There had been a lot of underage drinking, and Susan was terrified her parents would find out. She said she'd just lie about how the windows got broken, blame it on a tree branch or a deer or something. The drive back was dead silent. Kate and I were both on edge, replaying everything in our heads. I kept staring out the window, half expecting to see someone standing by the road. But we didn't. Nothing happened after that. The group never came back, and nobody got hurt. But it stuck with me, not because of what actually happened, although it was scary, but because it could have been worse, way worse. There were a lot of what ifs. What if someone had a gun and used it? What if someone had gotten too drunk to react in time? What if Susan's parents had walked in during the chaos? It was one of those nights where you look back and realize how close everything came to going horribly wrong. And even though we laughed about it later, there was still this part of me that couldn't shake the feeling that something about that night wasn't just a bad experience. It was a warning. A cabin in the woods, full of teenagers, some drunk, some angry, some completely unaware of the danger they were in. That night was a mess, but it could have easily turned into something much darker. I've never gone back to that area since. I don't think I ever will. I was 11 when this happened. My older sister Ariel was 14 and my younger sister Belle was 8. My dad was a freelance programmer, and while he made good money from big projects, he was drowning in debt. Over $500,000, I remember hearing once. My mom wasn't any better at managing money, so we didn't get to do the things other families did. We never had family vacations to Disney or flights to beaches. Our vacations usually meant visiting a relative's house, sleeping on a couch, and being told not to touch anything. But that one week, things were different. Dad had just wrapped up a major project for some company. He didn't tell us the details, he never did. But it was clear the paycheck had been a big one. We were celebrating that night at home. He bought a few frozen pizzas, root beer, and rented a scary movie, Final Destination. He loved horror movies, especially the ones that freaked us out. I didn't want to admit how much I liked them too, even if they kept me up at night. The movie was just getting to one of the more intense parts when the phone rang. Dad went to get it in the kitchen. We kept watching, but Belle, who was never great with scary stuff, paused the movie and grabbed Duchess, our dog, pulling her onto the couch for protection. A few minutes later, Dad came back with Mom, and they both had weird looks on their faces. Then they told us we were going on a weekend trip. Apparently, the client he'd worked for owned a cabin by a lake in the mountains and had offered it to Dad for almost nothing. They called it a thank you gift. It was already Thursday night, so Mom went into a whirlwind of packing. She was tossing clothes into bags, barking orders, and digging through drawers for sunscreen and bug spray. We didn't even get to finish the movie. The next day, Friday, we left right after school. It was about a 2.5-hour drive through winding roads that made Belle feel sick and turned Ariel's face into a permanent scowl. It was already getting dark when we finally pulled up to the cabin. The place was a single-story, long ranch-style house, with wood paneling and a stone chimney. It smelled like pine needles and old wood when we walked inside. There was a little nook just above the main living area that looked like a storage loft, but it had some pillows and a stack of dusty board games. It was just big enough for us kids to climb up and play. We immediately loved it and named it the Crow's Nest. Once we explored the cabin, we claimed our rooms. Mom and Dad took the big bedroom. Ariel grabbed the smaller room with a twin bed for herself. Belle and I got the remaining room. It had a queen-sized bed we'd have to share. The room had a window on the right side of the bed with no curtain, which bothered me a little. There was a lamp on a small table beside the bed, which was our only light source since the ceiling bulb didn't work. Across from the bed was a wooden closet, but it was locked tight. We tried the knob a few times, but it wouldn't budge. We joked about what might be inside, but no one could figure it out. That night, after we played games in the loft and had grilled cheese sandwiches for dinner, we went to bed around 11. I remember lying on the inside edge of the bed, closest to the lamp, while Belle slept near the window. She tended to kick in her sleep, and I didn't want to get hit. I must have passed out quickly, because the next thing I remember is Belle clawing at me in the middle of the night. She was trying to bury herself under my arm, shaking hard, and saying something I couldn't understand. I sat up, trying to wake up properly, and turned toward her side of the bed. Outside the window, I saw something. A pale shape, human-shaped, not clearly a face or a figure, but enough to tell it wasn't an animal, was moving away into the dark. My brain didn't fully register what I saw until it was already gone. But the panic hit hard once it did. I pulled Belle out of bed and we ran to our parents' room. They didn't believe us. Dad rubbed his face and told us we probably just had a nightmare. Mom told us to go back to bed, and if anything happened again, we should wake them up. I wanted to argue, but I didn't. I was just a kid. We went back to our room. Belle refused to sleep on her side now, so we switched. I read to her from an old paperback I'd brought until she drifted off. I fell asleep soon after. The next morning, things felt normal again. Sunlight made everything feel safe. We spent a couple of hours exploring around the lake. Belle found a bunch of frogs and wouldn't stop chasing them. Dad eventually loaded us back into the van and drove us into the nearby town. It had a strip of small shops, the kind that sell taffy and candles and handmade scarves. Mom spent forever in each one. We ate lunch at a diner with cracked leather booths and returned for dinner later that evening. By the time we got back to the cabin, it was nearly sunset. We were all in a good mood. Ariel had just made some joke about how we should pretend the cabin was haunted to mess with Belle when Dad suddenly raised his hand to stop us from walking. He took a few steps toward the front porch and just stood there, staring at the door. Then, without saying anything, he reached out with one finger and pushed it open. The door wasn't latched, not even shut all the way. I didn't understand what was wrong at first, but his face looked tense. He motioned for Ariel to keep close to Belle and me, but told us to stay quiet. Then he went inside by himself. We waited on the porch. Mom whispered his name at some point and he called back from inside, saying we could come in. When we stepped inside, he was standing in the middle of the living room, staring at the floor. He locked the door behind us and then quietly pulled Mom into their bedroom. Ariel distracted Belle and me with one of the board games. We hadn't even been playing 5 minutes when they came back out. Mom went straight to the kitchen and started washing the breakfast dishes from earlier. Dad sat with us and joined the game. He was smiling, but it didn't feel real. We played for a couple hours before he said it was bedtime. It was only 9, which made Ariel grumble. She always got to stay up late on weekends, but B and I went to bed. We slept in the same spots as before. I remember Belle asking if we could read again, so I read for a bit before we both fell asleep. The next thing I knew, Dad was rushing into our room, lifting Belle out of the bed and grabbing my hand. I was still half asleep when he yanked me into the hallway. I saw Ariel being pulled by Mom in the same way. The living room had this strange sound in it, like a high-pitched whine. It didn't make sense at first. Duchess was sitting by the back door, fur on end, growling low. Dad didn't put Belle down. He dragged us all out of the house and into the van. He only let go of me when we were inside and he had thrown Duchess in with us. Then he started the car and peeled out of the driveway like we were being chased. Nobody said a word the entire ride back. Not Mom, not Dad, not any of us. We didn't get home until close to 2 in the morning. Duchess eventually settled down in the back seat, but none of us kids could sleep. The next day, Dad told Ariel what happened, but not Belle or me. We only found out years later. He'd woken up that night because he heard something outside his bedroom window. Not just footsteps, but moaning, like someone hurt or trying to call for help, but muffled. When he looked outside, he saw that the front door was wide open. Stuff in the kitchen had been moved, drawers open, a cereal box dumped out on the counter. That's when Duchess started growling at the back door, which was cracked open. Not wide, but just enough. That was enough for him. He didn't try to find out who it was. He didn't check the rest of the cabin. He just got us out. He went back the next day during daylight to get our things. Nothing was stolen, nothing broken, but he found several sets of footprints outside our bedroom window. Adult-sized ones. More than one person. We never went back. My friend Lily has a cabin on a lake in Washington. It's tucked back in the trees, about a 10-minute drive from the nearest town, and surrounded by dense forest with only a few other cabins nearby. Most of them only used in the summer. That year, we were 15. Lily had invited me and her cousin Evan to spend a week with her at the cabin during the summer. It had been a great few days. Sunny, quiet, the kind of peaceful that makes you forget about phones and clocks and everything else. We swam, went canoeing, played board games when it rained, and fished in the lake almost every evening. It was the kind of summer break you think about when you're older and wish you could relive. On our last night, like we had done the previous evenings, we grabbed our fishing gear and walked to the lake. The path to the lake was a short 5-minute walk from the cabin. It started as a small paved trail where people jogged or walked their dogs during the day. It had a few wooden benches along the way and connected to another trail that led to a more public beach. But we never went to that beach. Instead, we went to our own quiet little spot, a secluded, hard-to-reach part of the shoreline with no official trail to it. To get there, we had to veer off the main path, climb over a log, push through some brush, and then go down a steep hill that was slippery with pine needles and rocks. It was easier going down than up. Coming back meant using our hands and feet to climb the steep incline. But the spot was beautiful. No other people, just the sound of water lapping against the rocks and trees rustling above us. That evening, we got there around 7. The sun was just starting to dip behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the lake. The air was cooler than it had been all day, but still warm enough to sit comfortably. We didn't catch much that night, just a couple small fish we tossed back. Mostly we just sat on a log near the water, talking about school and summer and whatever random things came up. None of us had our phones with us. I remember feeling calm, like the kind of quiet you don't even realize you needed until you're in it. At some point, maybe around 8:30, I looked around and realized how dark it had gotten. It wasn't pitch black, but it was definitely darker than I had expected. The lake had this odd way of making time feel like it moved slower, or maybe just made you forget to check the time at all. I told Lily and Evan that we should probably head back. They agreed, and we packed up our gear, bait box, rods, the small cooler with snacks, and started heading up the hill. It was harder in the dark. I slipped once and caught myself with my knee, getting it covered in dirt and leaves. We didn't talk much as we climbed, which I remember now as feeling kind of strange. Usually someone would be joking or complaining, but this time it was just quiet. Maybe we were all just tired. When we reached the trail again, I made a comment about how creepy it felt at night. I half joked that it felt like something out of a scary movie. That's when Evan decided to make it worse. He started talking about a story he'd read about mountain men from the 60s, some kind of weird cult that supposedly lived in the woods and did awful things to hikers and campers. He said they were murderers and that people still talked about seeing them every now and then. I didn't believe him, obviously, but I still told him to shut up. The way he told the story was too casual, and in the dark, it stuck with me more than I wanted it to. Then, out of nowhere, Evan stopped. He was ahead of us by just a few steps and suddenly froze. At first, I thought he was messing with us again, but when I saw his face, I knew he wasn't playing. He looked genuinely scared. Lily told him to stop being stupid and kept walking, so I followed her. But then Evan grabbed both of our arms hard and made us look where he was looking. I didn't see anything at first, just trees and shadows. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw what he had seen. There was a man, or at least it looked like a man. He was big, tall, broad shoulders, wearing what looked like dark, dirty clothes. He was stumbling a little as he walked, slowly but definitely toward us. He wasn't calling out or waving or anything like that, just walking, staggering straight in our direction from the woods to the side of the trail. At first, I thought maybe he was drunk or hurt, but something about the way he moved didn't sit right. There was no flashlight, no sign he had been hiking, no backpack. Just this silent figure moving through the trees like he knew exactly where we were. We all panicked. We didn't say a word. We just turned and ran. The rest of the climb was steep, and we were practically crawling to get up the hill. I slipped again and cut my hand on a rock, but I didn't stop. I looked back once, and I saw him again. He was closer, definitely moving faster than he had been before. Not running exactly, but quicker than before. I don't think he said a single word, just moved toward us with his arms swinging stiffly by his sides. We finally got to the top and sprinted the last stretch of trail. The trees opened up near the road that ran in front of the cabin, and I remember my lungs burning and my heart pounding so hard I could barely think. We didn't stop until we were at the front porch. We dropped our stuff on the deck and realized the front door was locked. Lily and Evan immediately started banging out the family's secret knock. It was this complicated rhythm they used to make sure it was someone they knew at the door. I stood with my back to the woods, just staring, expecting to see the man come out of the trees at any second. But nothing came. Nobody followed. Lily's uncle opened the door and let us in. All three of us were out of breath and borderline hysterical. We told the adults everything. Her uncle and mom said it was probably just a hiker or someone who got lost, but none of us believed that. It didn't feel like that. It didn't feel like someone who wanted help. Felt wrong. That night, Lily and I went downstairs to the walkout basement where we slept. It wasn't creepy. There were big windows and a door to the backyard, almost like another floor of the house. We were still a bit shaken, but it felt safer with everyone home. We got into pajamas and tried to calm down, talking quietly about how maybe we had just scared ourselves. Then we heard it. The knock. The exact same family knock. That complicated rhythm. But it wasn't on the door upstairs. It was at the window. We froze. Neither of us said a word. The window was just a few feet from the bunk beds. We didn't dare look. We just sat there wide-eyed, listening. Then it happened again. Same rhythm, but this time a little faster. Like whoever was doing it was more frantic. I don't even remember standing up. We just ran. We bolted up the stairs and into the living room where Lily's family and Evan were still awake. We were in full panic mode. We told them through tears what we heard. Evan's face went pale. He went downstairs to check. When he came back, he said it was definitely the knock. Lily's uncle, older cousin, and her brother grabbed flashlights and headed outside. A few minutes later, we heard the knock again, this time on the front door. Then again. It happened 3 times before Lily's uncle came back inside and called the police. The knock stopped shortly after the call. No more windows, no more doors. When the police arrived, they searched the area around the cabin with their flashlights. They didn't find anyone. We told them everything, the man on the trail, the knocking, the window. The officer said it was probably just someone trying to scare us. But what stuck with me the most was that knock. It wasn't something you could guess. It was weirdly specific, and someone outside had repeated it perfectly. We didn't sleep much that night. All 3 of us ended up sleeping in the living room together, lights on. Every sound outside made me flinch. The next morning, we packed up early and left. That was the last time I ever stayed at that cabin. Lily went back with her family the next summer, but I couldn't do it. I still think about that knock. Whoever it was, they weren't lost. They weren't drunk. They weren't confused. They were trying to get in. It was late November in Colorado, right before the snow really started falling hard. I was about 7 or 8 years old when my dad got the idea to take our family on a weekend trip to a cabin. He said it would be a good way for all of us to spend time together, him, my mom, my older sister, and me. My mom loved the idea, especially since we'd all been kind of stuck in our routines. I didn't mind at all. In fact, I was excited because it meant we got to leave a day early from school on Friday, and at that age, nothing beat getting out of class. The drive up was long. The trees got taller and the air got colder the higher we climbed into the mountains. By the time we reached the cabin, it was already dark and freezing. We were surrounded by thick forest, no neighbors in sight. The place looked old, but in a cozy way. It had a small front porch, some steps that creaked under our feet, and a chimney that was already letting out a thin trail of smoke since my dad had arrived earlier in the day to get the fire going. The inside smelled like wood and something sweet, probably the hot chocolate Mom had made in a thermos for the ride. We picked our sleeping spots. My sister got the top bunk, I took the bottom, and our parents had the bedroom next door. We ate dinner, something simple, like canned soup and sandwiches, and sat around talking about what we'd do the next day. Maybe hike around the lake nearby or go exploring through the woods. Nothing big, just family stuff. That first night was quiet at first. We were tucked into bed, and I was just staring at the wood planks above me, listening to the fire pop in the other room and my sister's breathing above me. But then I heard something outside. It was faint, like slow crunching footsteps, maybe. I sat up and looked toward the window, but I couldn't see anything. Just the trees and the light of the moon on the snow. I figured maybe it was an animal and tried to convince myself it was nothing. 15 minutes later, I heard it again, this time closer. Not constant, just a couple of slow steps and then silence. I whispered to my sister and she woke up annoyed at first, but then she heard it too. We got up and crept to the window, pushing the curtain aside just enough to peek. There was something out there, not an animal. It was standing too upright, but it was far enough away that we couldn't see much detail. We ducked down quick, thinking if we could see it, maybe it could see us. We didn't sleep much that night. I stared at the cabin door, just hoping it would stay shut until the morning. The next day, my mom was already cooking breakfast when we got up. She smiled and said we must have been really tired because we looked like we hadn't slept at all. I asked if I could go outside with Dad, who was already chopping wood or something near the trees. She said sure, as long as I had my coat and gloves. When I stepped outside, my dad wasn't alone. There was a short, chubby man standing near him. The man looked strange. He had a shaved head, a beard that looked a few days unshaven, and he was wearing a dark green veteran cap. But the weird part was how much he was sweating. It was freezing outside. I mean, I had 2 layers on and still felt cold. But this guy was red in the face and beads of sweat were running down the sides of his head. My dad introduced me and the guy said his name was Patrick. I said hello. He smiled wide, too wide, and his eyes stayed on me just a little too long. I didn't like it. I asked him, probably rudely, if he was scared or something. He kind of coughed and said he had shell shock from being a veteran. He laughed a little like it was a joke, but there was something off about the way he said it. Patrick said his family had rented a cabin nearby and he'd seen ours from a distance. Said he wanted to be friendly and introduce himself. My dad seemed to like him. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the veteran thing or the way Patrick acted like he wanted to help chop wood or something. My dad invited him in for breakfast. I stayed outside with them for a bit afterward, throwing snowballs at a tree while they talked. While playing, I slipped on a patch of ice and scraped my knee on a rock under the snow. I started crying a little. It really hurt. My dad had gone inside to help my mom with something, and Patrick ran over to me and said he had Band-Aids at his cabin. He said we could go real quick and come back. I nodded, thinking that sounded okay. I just wanted the sting on my knee to go away. We walked for a long time. His cabin wasn't close. It was way deeper in the woods, like at least a 20-minute walk. The trees started getting thicker, and I remember the light from the sky felt dimmer, even though it wasn't late. When we got there, I noticed something right away. There were no lights on, no sounds, no signs of anyone else being there. He told me to go in first. I did. Inside, it was dark and smelled weird. Not bad, just off. The kind of smell you notice when someone's lived in a place for too long without really cleaning it. I asked where his family was, and he didn't answer. He acted like he didn't hear me. Then he locked the door. I remember the sound of that lock so clearly. It echoed in my ears, and my chest got tight. He said he'd grab a Band-Aid and walked into the kitchen. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there. He came back and handed it to me, told me to sit down so he could put it on. I sat down because I didn't know what else to do. As he put it on my leg, he rubbed up and down with his other hand and said something like, "You're a muscular kid." I liked that. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew I didn't like how he said it. I stood up fast and said I felt better and needed to go back. He kept smiling and told me to stay and eat. I didn't know how to say no. The door was locked, and I didn't want to make him mad. He asked how much I weighed, and I guessed around 70 pounds. His smile got bigger, and he nodded like that number meant something to him. I asked to leave again, and he said no. He said things were just getting started. Then there was a loud noise behind one of the doors, someone yelling. He rushed over, opened the door, and shouted something about staying in the room and not moving. Then he came back out, smiling again. He said his wife was sick and couldn't be around visitors. But a few minutes later, she came out of the room anyway. She looked awful, skin pale, eyes red, hair a mess. She said she was hungry. He screamed at her, told her to get back in the room, and she did. I couldn't stop shaking. I asked about his kids. He didn't answer. Instead, he said he had some kids' clothes he wanted me to try on. I started crying. He hugged me, said everything would be okay, and told me to try the clothes. He went to the back room to get them. That was my chance. I quietly walked to the door, unlocked it, and slipped outside. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. I ran. Through the snow, through the trees, not looking back. I heard him shouting behind me, screaming at his wife, then calling for me, telling me it was okay and that I could come back for toys. I didn't stop. I ran and ran, trying to keep a straight path. I didn't care if I got lost. Couldn't go back. After what felt like forever, I saw a cabin up ahead. Ours. My dad was outside yelling my name. I ran into his arms, crying. I told him everything, every detail, what Patrick said and did, how he touched my leg, how he tried to get me to try on clothes. My dad turned pale. He went inside and called the person who rented him the cabin. That guy called the police right away. We left that same day. The next day, we heard back. The man who rented the cabins went with the police to Patrick's cabin. But it was empty. Nobody was there. Just a bunch of clothes, some old food, and his stuff. No sign of his wife. No sign of Patrick. Nothing. The police never followed up. Never gave us answers. It was like he vanished. He hadn't rented the cabin through normal means either. He must have found it empty and stayed there. We never learned his real name. I never found out what happened to that pale woman, or if she was really his wife. I don't know how long he had been living there, but I know one thing: if I hadn't left when I did, something really bad could have happened to me. I still think about it sometimes, about the way he smiled, the way he talked, and the sound of that lock. And I always wonder how many other kids he tried to bring into that cabin, and if anyone ever found out who he really was. This is a true story. Every time I tell it, people stop what they're doing and just stare. I don't know why it still feels surreal when I think back on it, but it does. It happened in the summer of 2020, when the world was still strange and half shut down. My friends Alex, Violet, and I were dying to get out of the city. After months of being cooped up indoors, we were going stir-crazy. Cabin fever had eaten its way into our brains. We were all working from home, barely seeing anyone, and the stress of the pandemic just kept building. We started talking about taking a trip somewhere isolated, somewhere surrounded by nature, something where we could get away from the noise and the fear and just breathe for a while. We picked a mountainous state, I won't say which one, and made plans to spend about a week camping and hiking at a few different locations. Nothing fancy, just some fresh air and space. One night, for fun, we decided to book a cabin instead of sleeping in tents. Felt like a nice break in the middle of the trip. The one we found was next to an old fire tower that people could sometimes visit. It was cheap, looked clean from the pictures, and was completely secluded. It was the only building anywhere near the top of a mountain, and the idea of having a place all to ourselves felt exciting. We imagined loud music, stupid games, and being as obnoxious as we wanted without having to worry about anyone complaining. In the weeks before we left, Violet brought up the idea of bringing acid. It wasn't new for us. We tripped together a couple of times before in controlled environments, and it always felt manageable and kind of bonding. She brought a full sheet with her, tucked into her bag the morning we left. I remember backing the car out of my driveway, watching the road blur by, and just feeling this deep unease in my stomach, like a heaviness that I couldn't shake. I told them I didn't want to do acid that night, not in a place we didn't know, not that far away from help. Violet got really upset. Alex tried to play peacekeeper, but the argument got bad enough that we almost turned back home. Still, I stood my ground. I couldn't explain it, but everything in my body was saying no. Eventually, the tension settled, and we kept driving. The road to the cabin was rough. It was barely a road, just a winding, cracked path through the trees, all uphill, no signs, no guardrails, no other cabins, no campsites, just one long, winding road that led to the top. We didn't pass a single car coming down, and there was nowhere to turn off. We had no clue how long it had been since the last people had stayed there. The cabin itself was a small wooden structure just a few yards away from the base of the fire tower. The tower was old and metal, with a staircase spiraling up to the lookout deck. We unpacked quickly and lit a fire outside to stay warm. It was early evening, but the sun was dropping fast, and the shadows between the trees made everything feel a little too dark already. The air up there was thin and crisp, and there was a stillness that made the crackling of the fire sound unnaturally loud. As night fell, we heard the sound of an engine. That was the first time I remember the three of us looking at each other in silence. Then headlights appeared on the road below, weaving up toward us. A side-by-side utility vehicle with 3 kids in it pulled up near the tower. They gave us a wave, smiled, then climbed the tower. They hung around up top for a few minutes, then drove back down. We had read in the cabin's online listing that the fire tower occasionally had visitors, so we weren't surprised. If anything, it was a little comforting to see actual people out there. After they left, we doused the fire, went inside, and cooked some hot dogs on the little propane burner in the kitchen. It wasn't much of a meal, but it was enough. We ate fast and didn't talk much. The silence outside had become heavy, the kind of silence that presses against the windows and makes your own breath sound too loud. The only thing we could hear was the wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of the old wood the cabin was made of. I didn't realize how much background noise there usually is until it was completely gone. No cars, no sirens, no appliances humming. Just us, the trees, and the wind. Every time we heard a branch snap, we froze. Every gust of wind made us glance toward the windows. Eventually, I grabbed a few wine coolers from the little cooler we had brought and passed them out. I needed to loosen up, and it seemed like the others did too. I found an old board game in the closet and threw it down on the table between our bunks. We started playing, and within an hour we were laughing. Not drunk, just relaxed enough to enjoy ourselves. For the first time since we arrived, it started to feel like the night we had planned. Later, I would remember hearing something in the background, like an engine, faint and low, maybe further down the hill, and maybe the occasional crack of a branch, but I ignored it. We all ignored it. None of us wanted to break the mood. That's when the hand slapped the window. 3 loud, distinct smacks. It was a small window between our bunks just above the table. There was no curtain, just glass. The slap echoed in the cabin like a gunshot. All of us jumped up instantly. I don't even remember if we screamed first or just stared. I think Alex was the first to move. He pulled out his phone and called 911. No hesitation. He put it on speaker and handed it to me while he grabbed the fireplace pokers and passed them around. Violet started shaking. Then she began calling her family, just saying goodbye over and over. She thought we were going to die. I wasn't far behind her in that thinking. I couldn't stop listening, trying to hear more footsteps or voices or anything. But there was nothing. Whoever had slapped the window had heard us call for help and decided to be quiet. They didn't run off crashing through the woods. They retreated in silence. The police arrived maybe 20 minutes later. I don't know how they got up that road so fast, but I was never more grateful to see flashing lights. They brought dogs and combed the mountain. They found nothing, not a single footprint. They told us it might have been a bear. That's what they're supposed to say, I guess. But there's no way it was a bear. We barely cooked those hot dogs. The only heat source was inside, and there were no food scraps outside. And why would a bear slap a window like a person? Why not go for the smell of food instead of the sound of voices? Why sneak off quietly instead of running when we screamed? None of it added up. The officers told us they saw a car parked at the base of the mountain as they were driving up, just sitting there on the side of the road. No one inside, no one nearby. That's when my blood ran cold. We hadn't passed any cars. There was nowhere else to go. That road only led to the cabin. If that car was there, it meant someone had stopped and walked the rest of the way up, in the dark, just to reach us. When we got outside to leave, Violet screamed. Her car, which had been coated in a fine layer of mountain dust from the drive up, was covered in handprints. All over the sides, on the back window, on the roof, dozens of them. Smears in the dust where someone had dragged their fingers, or maybe leaned up against the door. Places none of us had touched. Someone had walked around the whole vehicle, inspecting it, watching us. We threw everything we had into the trunk without a second thought. We didn't even try to organize or pack properly. We just wanted off that mountain. We followed the police down, every dip and pothole feeling like a step back towards safety. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't stop thinking about that car. Who parks in the middle of nowhere at 1 a.m.? Who climbs a steep, winding road in the dark without a flashlight, just to sneak up on a cabin? It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a wild animal. It was someone who didn't want to be seen, someone who didn't want to be heard, someone who planned every step of what they were doing. I don't know what they wanted. I don't want to know. Maybe they were hoping we'd be too out of it to defend ourselves. Maybe if we had taken the acid like Violet wanted, we wouldn't have even noticed the hand on the window until it was too late. I've never been back to that state. I'll never go back to that mountain. We never found out who it was or why they were there. But I think about that car, that hand on the window, those prints in the dust, and I'm just glad we didn't stay another night.